Hello everyone, today we proceed on uncharted territory, introducing some aspects of the Silver Age and of the Amazonian cycle. We dedicated a lot of time to the heroic cycles of essentially the Iron Age and or the Bronze Iron Age. There is all a prehistory, let's say, in tradition that is appropriately described by mythology, but as such clashing with the more modern secular understanding of the history of mankind. This is not really a bit of dealing with that historical, prehistorical perspective. I also, I think, have been pretty vocal concerning how or why we expound tradition, what for. This is not meant to prove for now anything beyond what we're merely reporting from ancient sources. But there is definitely a lot to think about this, because these are not just archetypal myths. There seems to be something that at least goes far back in time, and that may shed light a bit. Like, I hate the term shedding light when we talk about history, because history sort of is exactly a myth at this point. In the right way, it should, right? And if anything, this is the point. We should habituate ourselves to be a bit less skepticistic and a bit more attentive to what sources tell us, right? I will not start my criticism about how the modern historiography operates, nor the issues regarding the hyperspecialization, the loss of an interest even in this primarily original topics, so to say. Today we just discuss this. We can start from this, if you want. That is how the heroic cycle. Then now we will see better. If you have missed my content on this, you will now get some more of it to understand. Occasionally incorporates the theme of the diet that is, in this sense, as we'll understand now, a quite older one, right? Encompassing the couple and the woman. Yet deploying this motive, I want to say that diet in this sense is older than the heroic motive, because the heroic motive is primarily connected with the Golden Age. And so the heroic cycles that we've seen so far, mostly just how these were rebooted in later history. And this is another story, but another foundational core concept is the one of the diet. That encompasses, in fact, the couple as the masculine and the feminine in archetype and hierarchically, complementarily tied, indescribably tied to one another, at least in the plenitude of the Golden Age. And in fact, the theme of the woman per se, right? This deploys a motive with a significance that diverges from other previously examined instances on Schwerpunkt. We just began talking about tradition, even if we do so from a couple of years, or actually more, it's like 5 years that we started getting to the depths of that, aside from our general historical lens. But this particular balance corresponds exactly to what was delineated in other videos when we addressed the saga of the Rex Nemorensis. So the priest king, so the sacred ruler, belonging truly to a golden, in this sense, timeless era more than else. This serves the archetype better than even the same Uranian plenitude, right, of virile authority. Why? Because he, just as it was the case in antiquity, still held the royal and priestly power in himself, in one, right? He presided more specifically in the saga over the sacred grove of Diana Nemorensis. As you know, this is a Latin myth famously also studied by Fraser, and it has echoes, parallelisms, as we'll see now, in many other religions. This is, in fact, by specifically from a geographical standpoint, by the volcanic crater Lake of Nemi in the Alban hills of ancient Latium, so quite ancestral to Romanity and Latinity in many ways. This was a site long revered, in fact, as the mirror of Diana, right? In a truly chthonic sense, if you wonder, we've seen how the mirror is the Venusian symbol, perhaps par excellence. We've seen it even in the Pictish stones, etc. And indeed, a volcan that emerges. There's a mountain that emerges with a lake, right, from the bowels of the earth is very much tied to this idea, not just of a chthonic force, but as we've seen with Diana in our videos about the Hermetic tradition, actually the Olympian force of Diana is namely the transfigured woman, which is the same exact symbolism, the one of the moon, that the Virgin holds in Christendom. Namely, the idea that even though this is the epitome of femininity, the archetype par excellence of the woman, she is victorious as transfigured by the Rex Nemorensis, her husband, that has fully elevated her. In fact, like, if you want, the Alban Hills are the best example of this because, as you know, Alba Longa and the Temple of Jupiter Latiaris, that would have been ideally the Rex Nemorensis stood. We'll talk more about that as well, but for telling you how important it is as far as Roman history is concerned, right? And we know this profusely. There are archaeological finds of votive offerings, including jewelry, figurines, and garments from female suppliants attested to the goddess's protective powers over childbirth, healing, and asylum for fugitives there. But myth is particularly relevant because Diana is fundamentally the queen of the forest, and so of this untamed chthonic dimension that can be properly vivified by the Sky Father, right? And he, in fact, manages to seize her and fecundate her. Now, the relative twist of this saga is that the kingship was bound to a cyclical reaffirmation, regeneration, and specifically, and that's where it gets controversial, but nevertheless particularly meaningful, it would partly answer some Q&As that I'm avoiding from private emails, but if you in fact dig in my content, there is plenty of these explanations. Because this kingship was secured through a fugitive slave, ritually plucking a branch, often mythically identified, in fact with a golden bow, from a sacred tree, typically an oak in the grove. As you know, the oak is the symbol throughout all tradition, right? You find it in Rome on Capitol Hill. You find it. It's the Yggdrasil is in the Bible as well. It is always, as we'll see now also from Semitic tradition, always the tree of life points to this. And before slaying the reigning priest in mortal combat to assume the role, in other words, this slave had the value of breaking free, and so positing himself in a desertum, in a mystical ascesis, in a holy combat that he eventually succeeds in winning by becoming himself the king after having slain him and seizing the golden bow. And so the same queen of the forest as such, obviously gold symbolizing the full divinity of the system. We talked about this also in the video about the German the slumbering monarchs, right, in medieval folklore, where the idea is that the king has to return at some point to revive the tree of life, in whichever other sort of political territorial connotation affiliation is attached to it. And this stresses the continuity in the affirmation of this order, right? In tradition, order and the plenitude of God as well are never static, in the sense that they are static, but they're maintained by a force, all right? And this force perpetually occurs. And the idea is that, in theory, as we see in Mithras, as we see in any other circumstance where the son, fundamentally, and we'll understand now that this is a philosophical religious incest, manages by slaying the father to rise to his own level once again. Think about, again, Mithras, that from a stone, literally. And so less than anything else, right? The most courageously fallen element of the cosmos battles and defeats and becomes the sun himself, right? We don't need to, we talk about sacred royalty, there's no need to repeat this very much, but the golden bow myth, the one of the Rex Nemorensis, really well incarnates this provocative idea, which is embedded, for example, in the same, in basically all the foundational myths, the same one of Romulus. Think about how Romulus and Remus are born. There is a rape, literally, and the infringement of an absolute virginal status that, however, brings Romulus to fundamentally transcend as a god himself in the establishment, in fact, of the world domination of Rome. Think about all exiles, all the same Christianity. That's basically the same. And we don't need now to draw the parallelisms regarding, for example, for Christ being the sense both father, husband, and son of Mary, right? As the Sophia Perennis in this case. The parallelism is identical also because you find the motive throughout all these cultures. It's very strange. This is a very strange form of, let's say, comparative studies, where people say, but here I don't find that written. But can't you see the pattern? Can't you see? It can be written itself. Like we can write it down for you, right? It's like saying, I don't know, in these different branches of Indo-European peoples, here this people has this myth and this are they exist exactly because they split from a divine one, right? It's obviously they are going to differ because they are imperfect. And in a sense, this is valid for every incarnated people, for every fallen people, right? That is, all people on Earth, except the ones probably managed to transcend and win. We should sort of view a little bit the concept of incarnation, the concept of theosis, right? Because so far, only Indo-European religions and Christianity, this is perhaps valid also for the Far East, but we have to research more for that, have the same concept, right? Our Semitic religions do not quite have this, right? Or at least they had it presumably a very long time prior, but by the time of Christ, say, even later for Islam, you don't have this. I made multiple videos also as far as crusade warfare, holy war is concerned in this theology. But in any case, this act, right, of the slave breaking free, and so demonstrating actually to be worthy as a king, and so mirroring also the training of the outcast, of the war bands. We made lots of videos about this, that must be expelled, literally, must be ostracized by the Zipa in order to elevate themselves in the comitatus. So in this non-holy, non-sanctus space, right, where everything is rapidly in theory and tests, like in a furnace, the gold, the divine that has to rise, is, I would say, a pretty self-explanatory motive in history of religions and in tradition. And it's a violent cycle, as you understand, of renewal tied to fertility rites, lunar symbolism, and the goddess's dual aspects as huntress and guardian in the case of the Rex Nemorensis and so the Diana. Right? This, again, different deities can overlap or not. Consider how the first trinity in Rome, the archaic one, did not have a female element like the later one of, say, the Hellenizing era, right, with Hera and Minerva, so as Athena, as a matter of fact. So consider how this in archaic Latium could definitely identify Diana, as there were other, again, concepts of other hypostases of the one were understood with these traits. But with the Rex Nemorensis, we are definitely at a pretty important crossroad in understanding a more deeply archetypal meaning of this. And of course, it echoed deeper Italic and quite certainly in this sense also pre-Roman traditions of sacred regicide. So among the Latins, or also the same site where Rome would elevate, but from time immemorable, right? The sanctuary, besides, evolved through phases from archaic clearings and early temples in the late 6th century BC, right? Or pretty early on. So even before the conventional, say, the actual foundation of the Roman state, which, as you know, occurred roughly in the 4th century BC. Rome already existed, but of course Rome was not simply founded. It was perhaps conquered, seized by different Indo-European groups over time. Maybe if you follow Varro's dating, there's something to it, so back in time. But in the late 6th century BC is really a pretty archaic time under Latin influence, evolving later as a structure to monumental terraced structures after the Roman dominance following the dissolution of the Latin League post 338 BC. To prove how old and stratified this site was, there were theaters, baths, and additional shrines, but also evidence of Bronze Age precursors. So we're in an era of Indo-European control, but before the conventional arrival of the larger groups that we identify, if anything, politically as Italics that lorded over sort of some the peoples in any case that stand for the broader belt beaker cultural area. In any case, this is not much the point per se, right? But we definitely can see this ongoing votive practices spanning prehistory to late antiquity, which shows you how the sacred growth at Nemi, because this was an actual forest indeed, like one of the Golden Bow, near Lake Nemi in ancient Latium, was rooted in local culture. There was something hyper-historical, hyper-real to them. The Rex Nemorensis served as priest king of Diana Nemorensis, a title won and held through ritual combat, which also suggests, especially if you look at the history of Rome and certain negative criticism that existed to the ancient idea of this bands, right, war bands, literally that took power, like Romulus's Kellers, as a later negative criticism from a modernistic or secularistic standpoint, even the same antiquity for these time standards, is that this site was also understood as an asylum for fugitives. That even, brigands set themselves there, that war bands would take that place. And if you read the various accounts on the foundations of Rome, you have actually plenty of evidence of this idea of the hill, of the forest, of the Shival, for example, that descends right toward the waters, right, to nurture the twins. And definitely the wolf there stands for these war bands, these beast warriors packs, right? Not very different from Achilles and the centaurs, right? It's literally the same thing. More of that coming, because today we talk about the Amazons as we were talking about before. Ancient sources such as Strabo describe the priest of the Diana Grove always armed with a sword, vigilant against challengers in a barbaric Scythian-like rite. Ovid notes the strong of hand and fleet of foot holding the kingship, each perishing as he set the example. And Virgil connects it to Viribus, identified with Hippolytus in the Grove. In Hellenic mythology, by the way, Hippolytus was the chaste son of Theseus. As we'll see now, there is a relation, in fact, with women, like the seductive chthonic force that distracts the hero from absolute virility and the same victory over and the possession of the woman, right? In fact, he rejected here Hippolytus the advances of his stepmother Phaedra, and thus Aphrodite devoted himself to Artemis the huntress and was killed when Poseidon sent a sea monster that panicked his horses, dragging him to death, right? This is particularly important because he failed at that proof for that matter, right? However, Artemis, or Asclepius with her help, revived him, according to the story. As you know, also in the Tiber Island in Rome, it was an Asclepian, de facto. So that when Hippolytus was taken to Italy, according to myths, where he lived in the grove of Diana. And so this is more of a tonic strain to the story. But under the new name Virbus, so man of two lives, of twice a man, which, however, suggests the fact that he had finally won, right? Because this is the typical double of the doctrine of the two natures, right? And this suggests indeed the brutality of this mechanism as well, right? And the fact that Diana, again, is here not simply an Aphrodite, but an actual Artemis, as we said before, is the reason why he won through this feminine principle, right? And in fact, regarding this alternative presentation that the same symbolism can manifest depending on context, it suffices to observe that the woman who personifies a vivifying principle, exemplified by Eve, for example, explicitly named like the living one by Hebe, the daughter of Hera and Zeus. That is the Sophia Perennis, in practice. In fact, Hebe embodied eternal youth as cupbearer to the gods on Olympus, pouring nectar and ambrosia at divine feasts. And so she was essentially this principle of living itself that tectonically nurtured the Olympian dimension, the victors. She possessed the unique power, in fact, to restore youth to mortals, such as Iolaus. Her marriage to the deified Heracles after his apotheosis and completion of the 12 labors marked his full integration into the immortal Olympian order. And this is particularly relevant because, as you know, as we'll see now better in the Dorian tradition, there is never such a courageously and definitively founding element, and like the affirmation of the Hellenic center, right, of the world, as much as the actual success in divinization, right? Achilles goes to hell, essentially. Heracles doesn't, right? He actually wins his place in the firmament, and he is deified as an immortal, right? And by the way, you know what's the mechanism here, because Hebe was as we explained, daughter of Hera. Hera, that, as you know, was the arch enemy of Heracles, as the queen, simple in this sense, a still autonomously in this Hellenic mythology maternal principle. And so one that, in spite of her transfiguration by the possession by Zeus, was unequivocally the archetype of the feminine and ectonic force. And the interesting aspect, in fact, of this is that when Heracles earns Olympian immortality, he gets reconciled with Hera, which means that until you're God, you will be always infested by the feminine archetype that will be fully yours only when you fully manage to defeat it. Right? This is incredibly important. And this symbolized the elevation of heroic virtues into eternal, youthful, divine status. So you see that all these stories at the end of the day find their own parallelism with the feminine archetype, the necessity of striving, this violent cycle of victory, of possession. Traditions vary on, by the way, Eve's role succeeding on preceding Ganymede as cupbearer, for example. Her worship alongside Heracles, we're talking Hebe/Eve, in sites like Athens, the altar in the Kynosarges, and Kos emphasize bridal and rejuvenative functions, as detailed in Hesiod's Theogony, where she's daughter, in fact, of Zeus and Hera. In the Odyssey, by the way, consider she's daughter of Zeus and Hera, right? So she's straightforwardly stemming from the highest possible match, right? In this sense, being enabled not by a merely feminine principle, but the birth from her father. And so again, Artemis being the same, an Olympian, just like Athena and Apollo. They are all children of Zeus. Athena, in this sense, being the full cold and chthonic element of femininity, at least Artemis maintains chthonic habits of dwelling in the forest at night, etc. And Athena is born just out of the spirit of Zeus, out of the head, right? So these are all incredibly relevant aspects that will tie also with the anti-Amazonian motive there. This is also to be found, for example, in the Odyssey. In fact, Hebe is married there. There is a reference there to her marriage to Heracles. Parallel to this are embodiments of transcendent illumination or wisdom that corresponded to this divinized feminine principle, such as we just said, Athena, born directly from the mind of Olympian Zeus and acting as guide to Heracles, importantly enough. And so, as a double, like the idea of the Sophia Perennis being truly the soul of chivalry, like in the Middle Ages, right? The do and dal, the idea that that's your double in the sense of a complementary feminine element that is the only one through which you can achieve divinity, by the way. And in this case, guides you as stripped, as a virgin of any kind of contamination. And so in her full plenitude, stemming from God, right? And therefore, she's also the angel that brings you to heaven, just like the Valkyries or the Philsia in the Valhalla. This is Nike, this is Victoria, all right? It's the same identical figure. And we'll have one in the double, right? As a guardian angel, fundamentally. There is also an overlapping part with the Genius, and here we're not going to digress too much on it, but if you're interested in that, I made a video about the Genius Augusti that explains a bit this omnicomprehensive metaphysical mold that we're really built on, and that represents the vector of our divinization, if we are worth that, right? Indeed, again, it's full of parallelisms. There is the Virgin Sophia to get, which means, in the sense, knowledge. And so it's something not much leading to the esotericism of it, but the idea that it is a full awareness. It's a providence, fundamentally, of the higher nature. Together, for example, with the Madonna Intelligentia honored by the Fedeli d'Amore in communal Italy at the time of Dante, for example, among those nightly circles, infused with especially Ghibelline tradition that existed also among the Guelphs. Athena emerging fully armed also, and so having also this panoply that corresponds to a virile type of discipline, right? From Zeus's forehead after he swallowed her pregnant mother Metis, fascinatingly enough, the wise daughter of Oceanus and Thetis, to prevent a prophecy of overthrow by a stronger son, providing strategic counsel, martial prowess, and divine aid to heroes like Heracles during his exploit, such as assisting him in the retrieval of the apples of the Hesperides. It's incredibly relevant that Zeus birthed Athena from the fact of the encounter of the Thetis as an infant that emerges from a dawn from the waters, and from, in the sense, the same Oceanus, that is in turn emanating her as his possession, right? And so Zeus himself, understanding the power of these chthonic elements, literally remodels this chthonic potential by fully purifying it, by ingesting it. And Athena, in this full purification, in fact, emerges from the head as a man by discipline, but a woman by nature. And so it's of incredible metaphysical and anthropological value. No doubt Athena symbolized intellectual and martial wisdom aligned with Olympian sovereignty, patriarchal order, and the triumph of measured reason over chaotic forces. Key interventions included the gigantomachy, where she buried giants like Enceladus under Sicily. This is very interesting because of the volcanic background of this whole, that the ancients had spotted, which forces routinely erupted for these very seismic areas, right? As you know, so the same Latium, the Alban Mountains are volcanic. Sicily, obviously, is one of the single most seismically active regions, if not the most actually, in Europe, with the Etna mountain volcano, and support for Heracles against formidable foes, as well as guiding Perseus and Odysseus in quests that underscored her patronage of prudent heroism across epic traditions. The same before in the Hesiod's Theogony and Homer. This is also relevant considering that Apollo had founded Delphi, or at least refounded it, because it was the seat of the most important Pelasgian worship, according to legend. It made multiple videos of that. By slaying Python and relegating it in the abyss, this slaying had to be repeated. This is just like Sigurd and the dragon, right? It has to be renewed with fresh blood and sacrifice, in self-sacrifice in this metaphysical sense, in holy combat. And so all these monsters, all these forces, think about this when you look at ancient history and warfare, which peoples controlled what. This was all understood as, of course, this telluric forces influencing also the peoples that inhabited there. So what kind of peoples had to be tamed in order to control these areas? We also made a video about the Italic coastline in the eyes of the Hellenic travelers in their periploy. That's what you can see from the Odyssey, all those monsters from Sicily, southern Italy, etc. And this actually corresponded to also the piratic nests of the various populations of the hinterland that harassed Hellenic shipping over there. Now, the pattern that we religiously highlighted now further includes carriers of power, whether the Hindu Shakti or the Celtic battle goddess Morrigan, the Morrigu, extending her love to the heroes of the Ulster cycle. And as you know, she's a pretty dark force. Like, there is this idea that even though Ireland is possibly the whitest country in the world, there was, in the stratification of the various peoples who settled there, also during the increasing waves of Indo-European conquest, a greater difficulty to dilute the local chthonic forces of the pre-Apollonian virile cult there. And so in Gaelic mythology, you have actually this prepotently strong feminine principle that is incarnated by the Morrigan. It's really a multifaceted deity, really. She's the ultimate MILF, basically. And she, in fact, when she meets with Caucaline, that's the point. Not bad for a boy, so to say. And there is all a motive of sovereignty and war deity of the Tuatha De Danann, often appearing in tribal form. That's also quite an interesting Trinitarian reference that signals their plenitude of power, but mixed with a proceeding from heaven, at least in the mold, with Babd and Mashab manifesting in guises that tested or allied with Ulster heroes like Caucaline in the Tainbo Qualinga. And that is, in fact, a mix between a dark Mother Earth and an actual soul of chivalry. All right, and that's why she's so important. Remember what we said between Heracles and Hera. The feminine principle is always going to be your demon, so to say. It is the one that in holy combat must be summoned in order to be tamed, right? In face of death or fear, it's exactly the unleashing of the furies of the Erinyes from your own soul. And if you tame them, those are the same angels, transfigured angel women that bring you to heaven, all right? In that case, the Morrigu blended prophecy, shape-shifting into animals such as an eel, wolf, importantly enough, that they understand how syncretic this is, or heifer during combats at fords, battle frenzy, right? The Gaels had really a pretty substantial, the Dazak, like the Holy Fury, also an important degree of animal warriors tradition. We will come back to that at some point. but also territorial dominion. Remember the Nemorenses. I mean, these women controlled the forest, for example. If you look at the Irish landscape, especially at this point in history, you realize that dominating that was somehow dominating something much more primarily political and powerful. She had interactions that ultimately led to her healing through the hero's unwitting blessing of milk, right? So it's a mutual cooperation. It's a very interesting, as wild and brutal and actually really terrifying force, and it couldn't be otherwise with all these transfigured chthonic ones. In fact, what do you want to appreciate of the Northern European mythologies is that they're incredibly dark. They have a much more powerful chthonic dimension to it. They're much gloomier. The archetypes are all the same, right? But it's to say why the raven, for example, is much more prominent than the eagle. Like the Germans had the eagle themselves. They didn't have to wait for Rome. But indeed, as we've seen with this more established myths from Hellas, from Rome, the Indo-Europeans who conquered Southern Europe had a much greater confidence in themselves, right? Their foundational establishment in the by far most advanced parts of the continent symbolized a settled victory that had, we found here the cycles of slaying in both Delphi and the Alban Hills, etc., because that could not be eliminated from the theology of it. But they're much more foundational myths, whereas in Northern Europe, these forces are much more directly and intimately operating as a constant challenge, right? Also because society was much less stratified and it was much more complicated there to discern even who was the king as opposed from the slave, right? This underscored themes of sovereignty, fate, and the perilous allure of divine feminine intervention in heroic destiny, right? But it does definitely sound a bit like a pretty dangerously chthonic mix. The Morgue, again, there's plenty of references. Think about the warnings to Donu Kalinga Bull, which is yet another important monster like of chthonic nature. Think about the Tauromachia of Crete, of the Minoan world that literally depicted Zeus before sort of the Indo-European takeover, even though the Pelasgians themselves were partially Indo-European in origin, as just a demon that was brought down, subjugated by the Mother Earth, that with all those female priesthood, the Minoans worshipped, right? A bit the Mycenaeans had that as well. So the Dorians established something really much more brutally virile and Apollonianly lording in that sense. The Morgue is herself, just think about Odin and the omens of death, right? She appears as a crow or washer at the ford, foreshadowing the hero's demise amid the epic's cattle raid conflicts, because that's what basically the Irish were at the time. Things changed sort of only up to very recently in time. Some parts of the country you can argue that it's just joking, but there you do have all this pretty impressive set of notions that are preserved, as you know, in the Book of Leinster and related manuscripts. In any case, we shall make more about Gaelic tradition because it's quite a while we don't talk about Irish history to begin with. Needless to say, across these configurations, the feminine element serves as the object of a conquest that preserves and elevates the hero's virile character, allowing its integration into a higher plane rather than diminishing it. I made an entire video explaining how the hero's virile character is really elevated in the higher nature through the taming and possession of the woman. Within heroic type cycles that are thus dominated by the virile hero and that are at the root of Western civilization, one motive assumes markedly greater prominence, namely the sustained opposition to every so-called gynecocratic pretension. Next to this, there is an Amazonian initiative. Right, the Amazonian cycle is something very particular. We're not going to talk about it just per se, but it's something that detaches itself, for example, from the Demetrian one, from the Dionysian one. These are all distinct, right? They pertain also to different times in history. They can compenetrate each other, but archetypally are as separated as, say, the concept of man and woman. All right, so they're very important to observe. Not always Chthonic, for example, means Dionysian, right? Also, Amazonian includes something actually warlike, and so in theory pertaining to the virile element that is possessed by these aberrations, these women that want to be men and to live as such. And going against nature in any case, because they have to copulate and eventually slain the men they slept with, as well as killing the male born, right, to raise another generation of Amazons. So it's brutal enough. And this is definitely a perversion, a subversion. Naturally, most of this story derives, we have access to it from the Hellenic mythological arsenal, so to say. It's very well nourished, also from a literary standpoint, but we can find this motive pretty much in all other mythologies. Now, joined to the equally defining element for the very notion of the hero, an alliance force with the Olympian principle alongside combat against the Titanic, this complex receives unambiguous articulation in the Hellenic cycle, most vividly through the Dorian Heracles. Dorian traditions emphasized Heracles as a civilizing warrior king whose 12 labors imposed by Eurystheus under Hera's influence restored order against Celtic monsters, serpents, and hybrid beings like the Nemean lion, the Lernaean hydra, and Erymanthian boar. Right? These are all quite specific archetypal symbols. The lion is essentially the other peer, virile, earthly ruler, king contented, right? The Hydra is, in this sense, a chthonic aberration of nature, the hypertrophic monstruosity of an amphibious monster that fundamentally is perhaps the worst of the soul. The boar, as you know, is the symbol of priesthood, as a matter of fact, and so an element of, and so here you have the Trinity, by the way, as well. That, as we've seen, is to be tamed and possessed in a spiritual sense, as the boar is also often, in a sense, sacrificed to get the wisdom of it, the power of it. This is true for any other of these monsters, also the dragon, and obviously. But the boar is more elevated in that sense and tends to usurp the hero's place. All these tend to, but with the priesthood in a particular way. We're not going to talk much about the latter, but as you know also from our videos about the papas in the empire in the Middle Ages, there are specific functions attached to both archetypes. Then earthly they will instantiate in different ways, but in actually possessing each and every of them some elements from all these aspects. Boniface VIII and Philip IV of France both called themselves Caesars and claimed absolute spiritual superiority. Right, so this was the early 14th century, by the way. In any case, the Amazonian dimension and the gynecocratic pretension contrasted with earlier matrilinear egos in Mediterranean societies. In fact, they affirmed the Dorian myths definitely contrasted with earlier matrilinear egos in Mediterranean societies, tied with the Pelasgians. We made a couple of videos recently about them, and affirmed patriarchal solar heroes, as we just explained. Specific feats included, from side of Hercules, strangling the invulnerable Nemean lion barehanded for its impenetrable pelt. Right, which means that power assumed through, in fact, vesting the same lion skin, as you find pretty much like in the Beast Warriors war bands. So this was obviously an initiatic rite, and kind of one of the most basic ones. In fact, it's the first labor, as in Apollodorus Library 2.51. Slaying the multi-headed Hydra whose blood tipped his arrows, remember the same parallelism there that we drew with Sigurd, right? In that case, he just like, Achilles is another story, and there's a bit of tonic pinch, but it's basically the same point, like entering the blood of the dragon, except for the leaf that, as you know, will always be the sort of the, also Hercules actually dies according to, so the one version, to the most terrifying ways, but that's the point. Transmitted through tradition, like even say the higher you go, the smallest fault can destroy you, right? That's how terrifying the ascent to heaven really is. You have to go through hell, as a matter of fact, right? But indeed here, there is a power gotten from the Hydra. This was a second labor, with Iolaus's aid burning the necks of the Hydra as well. So a definitive distraction, impossibility of regeneration, right? It's like with the vampire, you have to drive a stake to its heart, you have to cut its head and burn the remains. Don't think that this is actually peregrinely just exposed. It's literally the same story, right? Or so cleaning the Augean stables by diverting rivers, which harnesses the forces, the chthonic forces of nature. This was the fifth labor, capturing man-eating mares after feeding their owner Diomedes to them. This is the eighth labor. Obtaining Hippolyta's girdle amid Amazon battles, right? These are all chthonic elements. Like there is chthonic animals, there is the feminine warrior, the latter was the ninth labor. Fetching Gerion's cattle from the far west, 10th labor. So once again, harnessing the chthonic elements. The bull of the Morrigan, remember, is something similar to this. Securing the Hesperides' apples, often with Atlas's aid, 11th labor from the Hyperboreans, and this has to do with the limits of the world and the limits of mortality. This directly ties with actually the failed Gilgamesh enterprise, and if you're interested in the Garden of the Hesperides, and so this place beyond the ocean, where across the ocean, where also Atlas, in fact, unsurprisingly spawns. Watch my video about Virgil's fourth eclogue and the Roman understanding of heaven, right, and what those fruits of golden and purpureal fruits of a transfigured earth mean, right? It's the earthly paradise, and the Romans definitely understood this also in the Augustan era. People who think that there was no heaven in Roman religion they should lose civic rights, as a matter of fact. Also, dragging Cerberus from the underworld, 12th labor. This is not that different from Fenrir and all the issues deriving from handling this quite sort of terrifying beast connected with war bands always, and this idea of needing to harness the lowest but still hungry and terrifying elements of the comitatus, so to say, all culminating in apotheosis, right, per Apollodorus and related traditions. Just as Theseus, Bellerophon, and Achilles engage the symbolic Amazons until their extermination, Heracles pursues the same course. Western heroes win, right? Theseus' abduction and integration of Antiope or Hippolyta symbolize Athenian triumph over the Amazonian separatism, threatening polis, order, and matriarchal autonomy. Bellerophon's victories over the Chimera and in alliance with Iobates reinforced heroic containment of female warrior autonomy through airborne assaults and subsequent triumphs. Achilles confronted Penthesilea in the Trojan War itself, right? All this is connected with the slaying of the Amazon, in a word or another, and themes echoed across epic traditions of subduing inverted sexual hierarchies, with Theseus also credited in joint expeditions alongside Heracles. There are different traditions in general. We don't look here at all the various philological layers, but we can easily make a video about this. alongside Heracles against, in fact, the warrior women dwelling by the Thermodon river. This is important because it's not merely an archetypal concept, right? All this was meant by tradition to have actually happened, right? It was archetypal, it was metaphysical, it was, say, beyond a common, banal, empty, and spiritual meaning. But it had actually happened in the world as was known, right? Naturally, as you know, there were the nomads of the Pontic steppes that by some degree did provide the Alains with some interesting glimpse in what it meant to see those female warrior riders, right? And we do have archaeological evidence. In fact, women buried in arms was in the Pontic steppe. Then we never really made a video about how or why women fought, if they did, etc., in different circumstances. Some did, obviously. The systematicity of this is a completely different story, but indeed there is a kernel of truth to all this. While the Lydian, naturally, again, the Scythians were a bit the world upside down, especially for the highly civilized Hellenes of, say, the classical era. So it is a trope, it is something sort of differently mutuated and so on, but those were in part also forces that the broader world had to cope with, right? And there was something ancestrally tying also these groups in Europe to the steppes themselves. You have the Lydian manifestation of Hercules momentarily yielding to Omphale, that is truly meant to be the womb, and so that the Mother Earth, etc. And so you find in this, again, Minoan, Lydian, there's more Levantine influenced, Levantine proper traditions where, again, the Dorian Zeus is somehow, or in this case, like Hercules, subjugated by female authorities, we were saying before. But also in Lydia, that was partially Hellenized. At the end of the day, Hercules, yes, he sleeps temporarily, but it's a bit like Odysseus, right? In fact, he's ensnared. There's always this chthonic sensual tension and pressure, right? As a veritable test, right? An initiatic test for the hero. The Odyssey is much more Pelasgian than, say, Pelasgianly vibing, so to say, in moral terms, spiritual terms, compared to the Iliad, but still, all right, the Iliad, again, witnesses the death of Achilles that goes to hell, does not actually transcend them. And the Dorian Hercules fundamentally remains, in any case, the one designated as a misogynist. So literally a misogynist, the enemy of the woman. Enemy understood in the terms that we explained, right? So a concurrent, right? One that has the duty also for love of the woman in the highest possible sense of taming her in order to possess her and elevate her too to the highest levels. They both have this capacity. The action and contemplation, it's different natures that conglomerate in one that is fully functional. As we were hinting at before, hostility from the earth goddess Hera marks Hercules from birth, as you know. He emerges strangling the pair of serpents dispatched by her for his destruction in his cradle at Thebes, an act of infant, superhuman strength that foreshadowed lifelong antagonism with the queen of the gods. As we will see now, also Apollo had been threatened by Hera. And so literally by the mother, and Apollo representing the most truly shining element of the virile cycle rebooting, right? The son of Zeus and also brother to Athena. That together, for example, save Orestes from, in the darkness, from the attack of the Erinyes. As also passing by the hill where Ares had slaughtered the Amazons. Even Ares had, that, as you know, is actually the dumb son that nobody likes, right? It has nothing to do with the Roman Mars, as to prove also that these are very different traditions within the Indo-European branches. Ares is actually the counter-altar to Athena. In fact, he's always defeated by Athena. She is actually the actual deity of war and holy war. Ares is just the dumb animal warrior that just fights for his own ego, and fails at the end of the day, even though he's pretty gifted as well. Hera, by the way, embodied aspects of chthonic and martial sovereignty as well, stemming from Zeus's infidelity with Alcmene. So Hera is not particularly happy about her marital life, at least in this sort of more chtonically oriented. The Hellenic mythology eventually derails in written historical tradition towards a more Pelagianly influenced, resurrecting force, right? The original Dorian myth was much more unscrupulously rigid and unequivocally virile and fully patriarchal and asensual, etc. This is the entire point of what we're telling here. Throughout Hercules' existence, he contends against Hera without succumbing, ultimately wounding her, and upon attaining Olympian immortality, taking possession of her only daughter Hebe, as we said before, the living expression of perennial youth. Scrutiny of additional figures belonging to the same cycle, whether in Western or Eastern settings, consistently surfaces these core themes with varying degrees of emphasis. Apollo's birth encounters as well, we said, every possible impediment from Hera, who receives significant assistance from Ares, bear it in mind, because it's not like the Pelasgian societies were meek, right? The idea is that they were dumb and violent. This is the idea of the barbarian. Ares does incarnate the barbarian in many ways. The civilized Greek is fighting under the auspices of Athena, right? Ares, at least, is all these forces are part of the pantheon, and they are used in some way. But Ares is the more instinctive dimension, right? The one that gradually, in fact, in the myth, is eventually discarded. In fact, he's a violent a violent war god associated with bloodlust and battlefield frenzy. Dispatches the serpent Python to harass the newborn Apollo at Delos, right? And so you have this association between the matriarchal principle, the gynecocratic one, that co-opts the dumb warrior that obeys to the woman, right? This is incredibly descriptive of certain societies that the Dorians fundamentally subjugate in the foundation of Hellas as we know it. Python is in itself a chthonic dragon guarding the oracle at Delphi and born from the slime of Deucalion's flood or Gaia's wrath, right? Always, again, a chthonic element, the most chthonic element possible. You understand here how the same Heracles' accomplishments definitely mirror Apollo's, right? With the Hydra, for example. In fact, also as the serpents sent by Hera in Hercules' cradle, Python is slain by the infant Apollo with arrows shortly after birth as well. And so there is this parallelism, and this is incredibly important in Hellenic tradition because it shows, again, how stronger the substratum of the victorious hero becoming god really is, right? In other European mythologies, you do find the sublimation of other aspects of this divinizing heroism, and sometimes in even more subtle ways, more challenged ones. But it's only not even the Vedas. The Vedas express the highest level of power. They're the most complete sources for our understanding of Indo-European theology. We've seen it also in the series about linguistics, sort of say phonology, even associated with theological principles. But in Greece, there is this sense of conquest, of a foundation, of affirmation, of reaffirmation, right? The cyclicity, reinsisting, trying to beat down this recurringly resurrecting Pelasgian element, right? In fact, Apollo's hammering of the snake, so to say, established his dominion over the prophetic scythe, of Delphi musical arts and purification rites despite Hera's machinations. Apollo subsequently fights Tithys, himself a son of the goddess who shields the giant, yet during the struggle Hera herself sustains injury from the Hyperborean hero. So you find the same identical pattern that we see also in Heracles' venture. Epic tradition records a comparable wounding of Aphrodite by Diomedes. In the Iliad, the latter, aided by Athena, pierced Aphrodite's hand as she rescued her son Aeneas from battle, highlighting heroic defiance of divine feminine interference and the limits imposed on Olympian gods when meddling in mortal wars under heroic protection. Right. That was also the Julian line from, from the Trojan background, as a matter of fact. So the point was never discarding the Venusian element, but taming and possessing it, like in this Olympian saga. And then we turn to the Semitic tradition, because this is definitely more ambiguous, right, regarding ultimate victory. There is this general spirit, as we were hinting at before, in the Semitic world, where the idea of divinization eventually fails, right? And this also influences the later development of these cultures. It's not like they hadn't had themselves the idea that they could obtain immortality. But at some point, in their history, earlier on than, say, in the European world, this mostly happened by the time of Christ already, right? And that's also how Christianity is providentially explained in that, but that's another story we're not going to cover now. Had abandoned that sense that you could save yourself by yourself. And as you know, the most important epos, the Semitic epos, is Gilgamesh's, right? This ultimate resolution of the Babylonian hero's quest for the plant of immortality, that you see is something that he was to get from a chthonic source, right? To appreciate the plenitude of the universe and being able to control it. And in the epos, this stays undetermined. At least, as you know, Gilgamesh fails, so you can argue that even the greatest hero in the epos was not capable of doing so. And he actually deals with their administering his realm. This is somehow close to what happens with Cain after the assassination of his brother, right? He loses in the sense, and God sends him out there in the world and becomes a builder of cities. And so you find this broader Semitic narrative that, in any case, is, in the case of Gilgamesh, as a whole, fundamentally recounting the hero's sustained struggle against the goddess Ishtar, right? The Aphroditic instantiation of the mother life in Mesopotamia. In fact, Gilgamesh spurns her amorous overtures after his victory over Humbaba in the cedar forest. Does it remind you of anything here? These themes recur. Think about the Tannhäuser and the Mount of Venus, right? You see the forest, the mountain. It's as we've seen also on the Alban Hills with the Lake Nemi and the Rex Neparensis, speak of a height, of an altitude, of something that is not vile. It is just for kings, right? And the tree of life representing this elevation. Gilgamesh on that occasion, and Ishtar was again the queen of the forest in that sense, sharply reproached her by enumerating the cruel fates already visited upon her prior mortal consorts, such as Tammuz, condemned to annual mourning, which is a terrible idea. I mean, it's not just a failing pretendant or former lover, but therefore somebody who was humiliated in not getting immortality, because evidently the promise was there as well in the Semitic background, and instead condemned to reflect on his guilt, right, on his failure, on having sort of miss that woman. You understand how anthropologically inspiring it is, for example, from the Indo-European side, to think that instead, no, there is untouchable and plenitude of virile victory that our Western world deeply believes in. Right? You have the Alalu bird maimed and left crying in the woods. Interestingly enough, among the lovers of Ishtar. A perfect lion torn apart, and a stallion burdened excessively. So you see, for example, comparing this with Heracles' labors, that the latter are actually ordering the world according to form and principle, patriarchal virtue, and virile authority. And all these elements, tectonic ones, are actually transfigured, right? They are either slain by the hero that absorbs their power, or they're eventually harnessed and kept by their masters, that Hercules, in this sense, rules over as an immortal deity, indeed. So you see how close, by the way, and if we're looking at Greece and the Levant, you know that the contact was incredibly strong. We saw this also from a military standpoint. The Argos panoply stemming from the Ratrians and the Hittite contact with the Assyrians. We have seen, when was it? Yesterday in the video about the Thermopylae, we talk about the archaic Hellenic participation in war bands of hoplites in the Achaemenid campaigns in Egypt, where the Persians conquered the North African country. So remember the parallelisms, and in this sense, how deep and meaningful the divide between these different spiritual orientations it is. Gilgamesh in all this, by the way, bitterly rejected Ishtar's promises of riches, fertility, tribute, lapis lazuli chariot, and dominion after beholding his royal splendor post Umbaba victory in the standard Babylonian version preserved on tablets from Nineveh and other sites, as you know. This episode in Tablet 6 underscores Gilgamesh's awareness of her inconstancy and leads to Ishtar's enraged appeal, in fact, to Anu for the bull of heaven, precipitating further calamities and Enkidu's death. Right, the press is the same Gilgamesh, but you see here the same idea of the bull of heaven, and so this prize must be tamed as well as chthonic dimension. Monumental depictions preserve an image of Gilgamesh that deviates strikingly from conventional types, presenting him as an exemplar of a distinct race, seemingly a remnant of an extremely ancient population that held sway over the Euphrates plains prior to the influx of even the Sumerian tribes and the Semites. Right? So we're to see this in a traditional lens of some kind of truly primordial hero that was to embody those archetypes in eras that were prior to the Bronze One. Also in a traditional scanning of the world's history by eras. The body appears large and broad, astonishingly muscled, while remaining both vigorous and agile. The head is massive, bony, nearly square, featuring a somewhat flattened face, a heavy nose, salient cheekbones encircled by abundant hair, and a thick beard arranged in symmetrical curls. Every youthful element within well-guarded Uruk succumbs to the hero's beauty and prodigious strength. This was their best man. The city's elders approach Ishtar with complaints concerning the neglect imposed by the rising generation. So it's a formless substance that creates problems under this gynecocracy. Gilgamesh then equips himself with arms, assumes royal insignia and diadem, so the unequivocal symbols of divine rule, and confronts the situation directly. Ishtar, inflamed by the same passion that kindled mortals, raises her eyes and extends the invitation. Come, Gilgamesh, become my husband. Bestow your love upon me as gift. You will be my spouse and I your wife. She promises a chariot of lapis lazuli set in gold with golden wheels and onyx horns harnessed to great lions. And so this is the idea of divinity ruling over the kinglets of the earth, right? Leading into a cedar fragrant house. Right, upon entering the land of the sea, will kiss Gilgamesh's feet, kings and lords will bow, tribute from mountain and plain will arrive, goats will flourish, ewes bear twins, mules proceed under their own burden, the chariot horse will gallop strongly, and the bull under yoke will admit no rival. Gilgamesh rejects the declaration with mingled contempt and alarm, invoking Tammuz, the husband of her youth, condemned to annual weeping. The spotted eagle loved, then maimed, so that it cries, "My wings in the woods." This was an eagle, right? So a symbol properly of virile order par excellence, right? And so you see, there is a scam behind Ishtar's promise, Venusian promising lies, right? The perfectly strong lion torn apart sevenfold, that, as we know from the Hermetic tradition, actually symbolizes the path of, there should be of recomposition, right, of destruction, but say the seven times, the path that will eventually bring back to divinity, but here is actually destroyed in seven parts, right? And so the opposite of that. And so here, the perfect lion representing the perfect hero, right? The stallion. So these are all male, virile, powerful figures, and further victims, right? Gilgamesh's countenance thus changes with fear and awe upon perceiving the scorpion man at Mount Mashu, whose savage aspect troubles his spirit. The scorpion man observes that his body is marked by the gods, while the mortal envelope remains human, right? So this is a symbol of strife, right? It's a bit like the griffin, right? It's a fighting being that still does not manage to reach heaven. And reassured Gilgamesh, you see there is some pathos in this Semitic version, the Chaldean myth. It relates his afflictions and seeks permission to proceed toward Utnapishtim, his father, transported among the gods, who can dispense life or death at will. Right? The scorpion man vainly highlights the awaiting perils. Foremost, the horrible obscurity enveloping the Mashu Mountains, traversed in total darkness for 12 double hours before emerging at sea, encircling the world adjacent to a marvelous wood with trees bearing fruits of precious stones like lapis lazuli. So exactly what Ishtar had promised Gilgamesh, right? And this must evidently be reached through this path of darkness. Ishtar wants to simply bestow to Gilgamesh, that in this sense has not tamed the darkness yet, and so can only be lured through this desert without the actual handling of the same. In fact, once admiration subsides, Gilgamesh laments and curses the ocean that bars further progress. So in the Chaldean myth, indeed, there's no beyond. The beyond is there, but it can't be reached, right? And so immortality is lost. And so this quest, as you know, in the broader myth, you know how the story goes, right? Gilgamesh is truly abated by the death of his companion. He seeks truly immortality, right, to reverse this curse of the fool. Sabitu, the virgin enthroned upon the seas, perceives Gilgamesh from afar. She is the one that he is supposed to seize, like, as we've seen before, Hercules with Hebe. All right, so Ishtar here is Aphrodite, is also like Hera, if you want. In this virgin across the seas, and so she's enthroned, she's the queen, right? It must be saved in the sense as perennial life, withdraws into her castle and barricades it. From the shore, Gilgamesh addresses her, alternating imploration and threat, which evidently don't, spark some great sense of accomplishment, right? It's more like a form of limit, in fact, of admission to limitation, adjuring assistance for the voyage. And so there is something pathetic in here. The virgin eventually yields to Gilgamesh's tears, acknowledging that none has ever crossed there since time immemorial, though valiant Shamash traversed the sea and inquires who else could follow. Another crucial parallelism can be drawn with Vedic tradition, right? So we move further east and we encounter Indra, celestial prototype of the hero, as you know, executing an action regarded as heroic and virile by striking with his thunderbolt the Amazonian celestial woman Ushas, all while exercising lordship over that woman, the Shakti, whose designation also conveys power. The Rig-Veda records that he performed a virile heroic deed when he struck the difficult-to-slay celestial woman. You see, taming in order to possess. So the slaying is never destructive, it's integrative, right? It's subsuming. Great Indra annihilated Ushas, daughter of Dyaus, that is the sky father as well. So you get back to the Rex Nemorensis' absoluteness of this hierarchy. Why does Indra annihilate her? Because, well, she had aspired to greatness. He crushed her chariot with his Vajra, causing her to flee in terror while leaving the broken vehicle behind. Right? You see, also in Gilgamesh's epos, you have the promise of the chariot. Right? We don't find this detail in particular in the West because, again, Hellas and Rome are more simply affirming. Right? Naturally, in Indian tradition, things had already gotten stratified by the time, so we have proper written sources of the Rig-Veda that now we will read to get also a bit more of the context of this crash. But it's always a woman that actually is rising on chariot. The time was meant to be a war chariot by the time these peoples were affirming their own identity. And so it's something perhaps in this sense echoing the same Amazonian cycle, not simply gynecocracy. Of course, the two things can fundamentally overlap. In fact, there is a difference between sending snakes at Apollo or Heracles and simply riding a horse or a war chariot. All right. So this appears in the Semitic tradition, in the Vedic tradition, that are older, right? By the time we're able to record them. And instead, say in the West, say by the time this stuff is written down, it was later, and so the mind had, and these ideas stem from more immediately primordial spirituality, where the technical or narrative detail was not even so important just per se. And this you can read this passage in hymns such as the Rig-Veda 430 and 138 that celebrate Indra's manifold victories, including his slaying Vrishtra, the releasing waters and cows, overthrowing force of the Dasa, and establishing cosmic order through feats that affirm Aryan dominion and solar sovereignty over dawns of chaotic forces. Right. In fact, additional exploit in these sources include aiding Kutsa, crossing floods with Turvasa and Yadu, and demolishing strongholds while embodying the Vritra's layer and Shaker of Worlds. All right, that is a bit like the Hydra and the Python. Allied priests, remembering holy law, rent Vritra limb from limb, bestowed the dawns, released waters, and chastised dragons at Kutsa's summons. Indra dispatched productive powers, clove hills, drove forth kine, drank pleasant meat, and granted increase through the trees surpassing might, while the sun shone by the hymn born of holy law. In heaven's midst the sun unyoked his car as the Arya met his foe. With Jisvan, Indra overthrew Pipu's solid force and conjured the Asura. He boldly felled unassailed force, destroyed godless treasure stores, seized strongholds, wealth like sun and moon, and demolished foes with flashing dart. Right, the indiscriminate takeover of the entire universe, both Chthonic and Uranian. Armed with resistless weapons, the Vritra Slayer whets darts and deals wounds. Bright Ushas feared his slaughtering bolt, abandoned her chariot, and departed. And that's the point where she gets defeated. And so, as you understand, this exploit belonged uniquely to Indra, when he alone left others bereft of sacrifice. Indra established the moon's ordering in heaven. You see, it's as if he had been ordering the same Diana / Artemis frame, right? And so this feminine element that in virile victory gets transfigured in divine order. No assembled gods conquered Indra in war when he lengthened days by night. I'm reading from the aforementioned sources. This is a paraphrasis, basically. For the oppressed and battling Kutsa, he stole the sun's car will. Right, so he actually prevents the feminine principle to rise, at least to attempt to rise to that ultimate divine power that could have never functionally been, but exercising a wrong authority in a world upside down. Fighting singly, Indra overcame furious gods and slew those who strove against him. For a mortal, he sped forth the sun and helped Etasa with might. As Vritra's slayer and Bhagavan fierce in wrath, he quelled the demon and achieved the heroic deed of smithing to death heaven's daughter, mediating ill. He crushed Ushas, though daughter of the sky, when she lifted herself in pride. Her chariot lay broken to pieces in Vipas while she fled far away. Valiantly he seized Sushna's amassed store and crushed his fortresses. He smote Kulitara's son Sambara, the Dasa, from the lofty hill, and slew 100,005 of Dasavarchen's forces, crushed like chariot fellies. He caused the unwedded damsel's castaway son to share loads, brought Turvasa and Yadu safely across the feared flood, slew, you see here there is the passage through the waters as well, and so he wins immortality. And he could everything also for others, like slew Arna and Citrarata, the Aryas, on the far side of the Sarayu, conducted the blind and lame forlorn ones, truly understood as incomplete, as undivine, right? Short-sighted in a providential sense. Overthrew 100 stone fortresses for Divodasa, brought oblations, and with magic power and weapons sent 30,000 dasas to slumber for the Biddy's sake. These are all references. Naturally, we're not going to make an entire video about each of these names, but if anything, we're going to look at the Rig-Veda a bit better in some other videos. As Vritra's slayer and lord of heroes, Indra stands as general lord of Kine for all and shaker of all things that be. Other beautiful parallelism that we already commented on in another video is the one with the Arthurian legend. When Parsifal departs, thereby causing the death of his mother who resisted his heroic vocation as celestial knight. This had happened as he was venturing across the woods, controlled by his mother, but he wasn't controlling, and sees passing by across the woods some knights, a war band of knights, of errant knights. He came back to his mother, and having told her what he saw, she, trying to protect her from the war, to shield him, right, to never let him spring out as in the divine, told those knights were angels that killed everything they touched, right? What we just read about Indra makes sense of it. It's not much just in a medieval mentality. Say, in the third quarter of the 12th century, where this stuff was written down, that there wasn't obviously a dualism about knighthood, the fact that there was always an inherent, as we've seen, dreadfully inherent potential for destruction, right? And we read the sacramentaries that were used in the Middle Ages for bloodletting and so on. The point here is that Indra, and so the absolute solar principle, kills, as we've seen, to reorder, right? It doesn't extinguish, but like in an hermetic fashion, as we've seen it before, also the failed enterprise in the Semitic instance with Ishtar, separates to rebuild, with the same elements, right? This is really beautiful and interesting. Then we have yet another parallelism in the Persian tradition, where the hero Rostam, according to the Shahnameh, the most famous Iranian epos, must thwart the dragon's ambush, appearing in the guise of whom, according to you, but of course of a seductive woman, prior to liberating a king, right, who through Rostam regains sight and attempts to scale heaven by means of eagles. The identical motive resurfaces. This is also true for Romulus, right? It restores the royalty of his ancestors after an usurpation, right? So the hero here is called properly to save the king from the upper hand of the queen. There is also the dragon. There is also the chthonic element. It has been elevated, yes, as a tree of life initially, but now is actually under false spoils, right? It's actually the dragon is actually a snake, right? In general, the seductive snare deployed by a woman seeking to divert a hero, understood as destroyer of titans, that she harnesses monstrous entities or insurgent warriors we've seen before, with Hera summoning Ares, as a matter of fact, or as champion of superior right, from a symbolic enterprise that occurs so frequently and popularly in all these religions, as we've seen, that further specific citations prove superfluous, right? We could actually search far and wide in many other cultures, many other myths, and this would always repeat itself. That's why also Fraser's golden bow was so popular and famous. This already happened in a time in which anthropology had given up sort of a proper understanding of sacrality, was already quite confused about what that all actually meant. But it's literally everywhere. It's sort of impossible not to see it in a dyadic sense. We see here, for example, there's a common denominator to maintain concerning such myths, legends, sagas. That is, the woman's snare equating to that of the flesh solely upon the lowest plane. In other words, it means that this word is a lie, and that only in an earthly sense a fake authority can claim to own the power that they don't. Right? Ishtar promises the chariot to Gilgamesh, but she doesn't even control that. Right? The same as we've seen in the Vedic tradition. Right? The Amazon, so to say, is to jump on the chariot, which is almost there. This tells you also how powerfully the chthonic element of India was seen by the Aryan conquerors to maintain this in the sagas, right, of the Vedas. So the illusory aspect, like the fake Gorgonid / Medusa's illusion and delusion that something earthly, this hologram of pure being, has any power when it's actually so easy to dispel through virility and divinity. All right? And this is not to say that the chthonic element is not dangerous, but it's dangerous to the point it's being able to instill, as seen especially in the Chaldean myth, this sense of despair, of pathos, of feeling. When you're heartbroken, right, the worst thing you can do is to continue to give way to that kind of feeling. As we've seen what happened to the lovers of Ishtar, right? The same eagle, the lion, so all the stallion, right? All these great symbols of virility, of divinity, that are literally the eagle with broken wings that cries in the forest. It's something trapped in the woman's power, in this sense, while not being able to spring out again. This psychologically speaking, I think it's incredibly powerful to anyone who has suffered such sentimental pain. And for this reason, it's granted that woman actually does bring death, right? Because death is the absence of power, the absence of divine, right? And so it's not much a thing. The delusion, the illusion, the falsity, the lie is to think that death has power. That has no power, right? That is just giving way to nothing, right? While the man, with capital M, surmounts that through spirit, advancing this from a lower level of masculinity, which is effectively a sensual one, a pathetic one, right? An animal one, a lesser people one, to spiritual, divine, Apollonian, immortal virility, right? The snare extended by woman or goddess simultaneously conveys on the esoteric level the ambush originating from a spirituality that devirilizes and tends to interrupt or deflect the drive toward the authentic supernatural. It is exactly what you see today with Islamist and communist propaganda. Lesser people that obviously root with inferior cultures because they would like everything to crumble have the only mean to demoralize. They don't have anything to build, right? That's why they are lesser people. And that's what they want to insinuate, right? This idea that nothing has meaning, right? That it's better to give way to death, like including themselves. Like, so it's the same identical trick that fooled no great civilization, no European ethos, right? There's no doubt that the West received by God the divine right to rule over the rest of the world, right? Mastery over origins, not constituting the primordial force itself but possessing it, defines the quality of the autophys and autotelos, an attribute often linked in Hellas precisely to the heroic ideal. Let's stop a moment on these terms, because autotheos and autotelos are compound Hellenic terms built obviously on the prefix auto, so the self, right? Autotheos stands for self-grown, self-produced, or growing spontaneously arising from itself. And so it has to do with augmentation, it has to do with the sense of divinity, right? It means self-existent or self-begotten. In other words, it's the Father of himself. Natural, native, or in its own essential nature, right? So self-actualized, self-sown, or spontaneously generated. This is used also as in different fields, including biology. For example, plants growing wild without cultivation. There is a glimpse of the original meaning in Gnosticism that adapted many sort of Catholic ideas as far as this ecumenic beliefs of universal domination from previous tradition, albeit now essentially stranded in a cage of materialism versus spiritualism. But autotheos appears as the name of an ion, so an emanation or divine attribute / hypostasis, often paired with hedon, that is pleasure, and translated as essential nature, self-begotten. And it can describe something that exists by its own nature, without external cause, sometimes used as an epithet for gods or divine beings, so self-generated. Whereas autotelos means self-ending, complete in itself, or having its end purpose within itself. All right. There is a related English term, autotelic. Of course, it's not that often used, but in philosophy you find it's an activity or thing done for its own sake, with intrinsic purpose, no external goal needed. For example, art, play, or flow state activities pursued purely for enjoyment. And in philosophy, for example, in Aristotle or later thinkers, it describes something self-sufficient, absolute, or self-contained. It implies independence or boldness, something that fulfills its own telos and purpose or completion. And obviously well applies to the divine here, right? It does not rely on anything or anyone else here to bestow on them power, because they are just like in the Trinity, like at this point all in one. The Son has become the Father through the Holy Ghost that bridged them, right? So the ego could fly again in this completion. Obviously enough, the woman does not confer that. The woman brings that, but it brings that by being tamed and possessed. And in fact, given this relation, like symbolism of parricide and incest occasionally expresses this quality. So the parasite signifying emancipation and the attainment of self-principal status, right? Incest in parallel fashion denoting possession of the primal generative matter as well, was the term being bull of your own mother as the divine. And that's why, say, the son, the victorious hero becomes the father of everybody, including the mother that has begotten him. We describe this again in other videos. Within the divine sphere, the spirit manifests, for instance, in the type of Zeus who slew his own father Cronus and possessed Mother Rhea after she assumed serpent form to evade him. This is very interesting because, as we have seen there, it's as if the female principle was fully transfigured only when virally held. And so if the the king had lost that place, the conquering hero unveils this misery of the feminine element having turned into a serpent without counterbalance, without control, without paternal form, right? And so this is an incest, because eventually Zeus becomes like the master of the same feminine principle, the mother. Indra, who like Apollo slays Python, exterminates the primordial serpent Eye or Vritra, while also figuring as slayer of the celestial father Dyaus, in certain Vedic allusions at least. And so this is interesting because it's a deep and as a heavy concept. As even the ultimate Sky Father is, say, not subject to cyclical change, but the idea is that in order to arrive to him, you must be at his own level as well, and surpassing him, right, and aggrandize. And so, again, this is not technically possible with the Father, but to become at his own level and to become himself, and so representated, especially in those levels of the lower nature where this spirit has faded for whichever reason. This embodies the heroic overthrow of older cosmic orders as well, that, as you understand here, actually correspond to specific eras. We will talk about it now. There is an idea of decline from the Golden Age through the Silver, the Bronze, up to the Iron One, where the feminine, in relative terms, increases power on Earth because the divine is ever less present in paternal form in the world. All right. The alchemic ars regia that we also deal with continues to conserve the theme of the philosophical incest quite explicitly, because it referred in the Renaissance and its later modern recollections truly to this renewal, right, of the parasite, through the parasite and the incest. Drawing upon the two redactions of solar symbolism previously utilized to demarcate differentiation with tradition, the heroic myth thus connects with the sun, joined to a principle of change. After all, the sun rises and goes down once again. And so in all these myths, if you look at, for example, Tiamat, Anaita, you have this chopping of the sun. God, right? Baal at some point is brought in hell, right? And so there's this castigation even there by that Canaanite vibe that is similar to what we've seen with Ishtar chopping the lion in 7 pieces, right? And that is, again, the same hermetic symbolism, numerology that we're referring to before. There you need a recompositive process so that the sun can rise again. And this happens, for example, in the Phoenician myth with Baal. This association, however, avoids essential subjection to the caducity and perpetual redissolution into Mother Earth that characterizes year gods, at least. Rather, the myth orients toward liberation from that principle as to achieve transfiguration and reintegration within Olympian immutability and immortal Uranian nature. In other words, it can be interpreted as, because the question is, how often does this happen? Right? Is there a linear cyclical view of the world? It's actually both, but the idea is that in God, this transfiguration and reintegration constantly happen in absolute terms and always, right? In an infinite time and space, so to say, because it's the pure actualization of being that achieves that just by existing, hyper existing. And so contemplating all this for an infinite amount of time, it's like Nietzsche's eternal return of equals, right? What you do eventually sets you like that, as in the myth, right? We encounter these unfortunate lovers maimed by the great mother that sort of remain there. Nobody kind of saves them, at least in the Semitic tradition. Then in the European one, as we've seen, and with Hercules, that sort of brings back sort of different elements of this world, just like Indra does, as we've seen with the bull, with cattle. This was understood quite importantly, knowing how to move this across the earth, surpassing the flood, and so surpassing the most chthonic element par excellence, that is the waters, right? From which the same divine principle had originated in the abyss, in the darkest of the female principle. Heroic civilizations emerging prior to the Iron Age, so we're talking the Bronze one mostly, an epoch divested of every spiritual principle, irrespective of kind, according to tradition, and position, in fact, alongside, say, I don't know, the millennia before the first one, embodied the overcoming Demetrian Aphroditic spirituality, right, and Titanic hubris alike. As we'll see, there was a prior Silver Age, right, aside from also the prior Golden one, right? And so the Bronze Age cult, the Age of Heroes, witnesses the restoration of a priorly usurped virile rule, right? The Demetrian element of the mother, the Aphroditic, erotic one of the lover that can be fundamentally also mixed, as you've seen from the prior myths, in that give birth to monsters. Like titans are formless, in other words, fatherless powers, right? And that's why they fail in the end, because the Demetrian Aphroditic element has not allowed them to fully grow into pure men, right? Amazons, here again, this video is not meant to explain how this should have actually happened in a mythological sense, because also the more you go back in time, in the eras, in the ages, the more difficult it is to explain this also in traditional terms, because there are more vague references to that. However, you understand that the Amazons, as we explained before, were also partially the relics of this fight. Like, it was a fierce anti-men mentality, but because it's as if these women had been orphaned by of a virile principle, and so they take up arms themselves to make up for it and to rule, right, in a way that is fundamentally different from a Demetrian and Aphroditic fashion. There are elements of that, because they are archetypal. There is a queen, for example, the Amazons. The Amazons are meant to properly attract also men at some point to reproduce and create the new generation of girls to train in that martial life, in that Ares's lifestyle, right? That's incredibly important, because eventually in part of the myth, the Amazons are destroyed by the same Ares. And so at that point, what does that mean? That even a lower beast-like animal warrior like Ares can crash the same equivalent that is a female, right? And so you can't really discredit there the potential, right? And so what you see in the Bronze Age in particular, and so with the great waves of the Urnfield culture, the sea peoples, definitely something big was happening. The notion, nothing was happening, was no invasion, no war band. It's a pile of BS, right? As if the Mycenaean civilization simply disappeared by itself or collapsed by itself without further pressure. We do know that these things happen, by the way, in many ways. And we can, in that sense, appreciate from the mists of sort of different parts of the continent beyond, as this virility being reaffirmed as a partial resurrection of the light of the north, a moment of restoration of the Arctic golden cycle. We never really talk about the Hyperborean world, right, and the absolute pole of the virile principle and solar power, but that's all tied, in fact, with the procession at various ages, and it's something that we still have never really dealt with, right? Particularly significant attaches to the labor of procuring the Garden of the Hesperides among those conferring Olympian immortality upon Heracles. That was crossing the ocean, as we've seen, so accomplishing what Gilgamesh had failed in doing, and that's where the Europeans affirmed this new spiritual wave that will bring to Alexander's conquest of Asia, the Roman conquest of the world, right? These are the most direct descendants of this. There are other cycles within the Fourth Age. You can look at the Germanic migrations. Basically, that's it, that reinvigorate that, at least for Europe proper, what we appreciate as Western civilization as the most effective preserver of tradition, of heroic virile order, right? Our Western world is a product of this nowadays. Exactly what, the radicals want to tell you, like that, I don't know, using logic is somehow racistic, or, order, discipline, coldness, right? Those are terrible things. Rationality intended in the traditional sense, right? So that's exactly, you see how actual this stuff is and how properly historically useful of an interpretation it is, right? Certain traditions indicate that Heracles reached this garden by traversing the symbolic northern sea, inaccessible to mortals by sea or land, because obviously the ocean is something metaphysical. Again, Virgil Force Eclogue is a splendid descriptor of this in the Roman legacy of the Indo-European faith, right? And this spacing of Heracles that is truly attaining full divinity, right, is showed when from the Hyperborean land the fair victor conveyed the olive employed to crown the triumphant at Olympia. The Olympic Games are actually meant to represent that feat, right, that is attempted, repeated, and was initially obviously a religious activity, as everything that existed at the time, telling the truth, but it was meant to replicate exactly those divine deeds, just like, I don't know, Hellenic theater was meant to, it was just like the succession of religious rites in particular. And mythology, the same mythology that, in fact, that was meant to reaffirm, like this reaffirmation of virility, for example. Right? Pindar's 10th Pythian Ode, a very important source, the earliest surviving, composed at age 24 for Hippocles of Pellina in Thessaly, at the behest of Thorax of the Aleudai. Why is this poem important? Because it links the noble descent of Larissa's lords to Spartan Heracles, right? And so to Heracles' line, as we've seen yesterday also with the Battle of the Thermopylae with Leonidas being one of these other descents. And so this Dorian memory that was preserved as coming from these waves of, say, across between the second and the first millennium BC, across the Balkans. Now, let's look at this ode, because it pronounces both Spartan Thessaly fortunate and the rulers descended from such heroes, from Heracles, and still proving worthy through prowess. Apollo willed the victory, yet innate virtue also guided Hippocles along his father's Phrygia's traces, who won armed races at Pytho beneath Kyra's slopes and twice at Olympia. Right? Again, mimicking Heracles' feats. May fortune persist, the ode says, and magnanimous wealth flourish. Serene heart renders one a god. Serene heart, understood here. We could also look at all the original, but again, we don't have all the time in the world. But here it's an imperturbable heart, one that is not caught by feminine passion and sensuality. The victor, think about Inez with Dido. Well, he initially is allured and he feels, but then he's called by the higher call. He doesn't feel anything. Dido kills herself. This sets the stages for Carthaginian revenge during the Punic Wars, and so the bloody battles between the Romans and the Carthaginians. But this is the destiny of the hero that also, in fact, will found exactly the dynasty from which the people that will crush Carthage and shift the moral compass, the metaphysical compass of the world, of the Mediterranean, from that Phoenician. In fact, gynecocracy. Dido is the queen of Carthage, right? And you have indeed female deities, as we've seen. The Saint Baal had gone under, even though he was the sky father, and with instead the primal absolute Roman virility, right? An Apollonian essence of splendor, of gold, of paternal form, right? And the ode says that the victor who beholds his son victorious attains the utmost mortal limit without scaling the brazen heaven. Right? This is incredibly important because it stresses how this activity was carried out to replicate that regeneration of royal power that we described before, also from the Rex Neponensis. The ode says, neither foot nor ship discovers the wondrous path to Hyperborean games. Perseus once arrived among those peoples at banquet, encountering hecatombs of asses offered to Apollo, who cherished their festivals and prayers and smiled at the bristling salacity of the brutes. Right? The muse remains present in their customs with choirs of maidens, lyres, and flutes. Crowned with golden laurel, they banquet joyfully, untouched by disease, wearisome of old age, toil or war, evading nemesis. This is truly the golden age. The son of Danae, breathing Provis and guided by Athena, reached this blessed gathering, slew the Gorgon, whose snake-haired head became stony death among Seriphos islanders. And then Pindar recalls himself from digression, anchoring the song like a ship and likening it to a bee darting among themes. He anticipates that the euphoria around the Peneus pouring forth his sweet voice will render Hippocles more radiant among youths and sweet to tender maidens. As you see, the maidens want him, but he's superior even, right? And it's not the other way around. He's not desirous, because that would be, you can't be desirous if you're perfect, right? And if anything, if you're perfect, you include the maidens. You have fully under your sway, right? But you have no whim. Whoever has a wish is selfish and is in a phase of becoming. In any case, it's not God, right? You understand why Pindar is writing this. He says, desires vary among men. One should seize the fleeting gift fortune presents, since none foresees future events, right? And this is naturally a reflection on the caducity of life. And fortune, if you are familiar with the Fortuna Caesaris, was obviously understood as the mean to constantly chase and gamble. Is the second element of the Clausewitzian Trinity. The Word, the Holy Ghost, the Mercurial element, also in tradition, in the Hermetic tradition. The strugglers. So the only way to arrive to a higher level, but potentially also losing, like the Titans did, for example, like the angels in the Bible. The angels are actually terrifying creatures, if you think about that. And all former heroes empowered to get aligned to God. Pindar says, confidence rests in Thorax who yoked the Pierian quadriga, and praise belongs to the good brothers upholding Thessalian laws according to ancestral guidance. Heraclean one. Pindar's third Olympian ode is also fascinating. This was written for Theron of Acragas during the Dioscuri Theoxenia, and it seeks to please the guest-loving Tindarids and Helen of bright hair while singing illustrious aggregates and the Olympic chariot victory of Theron. Right, the Helen symbolism there, obviously with fairness and whiteness, is echoing the same Iliad, right? And that's the same queen that, as you can see in potential, can unleash so much evoke, right? There is no firm patriarchal authority, right? Think about that when you read the Iliad. Why was the Trojan War fought, right? Because this fundamental cornerstone of paternal virility and divine heroism had fallen to a lower standard, and Helen is stripped from Menelaus by a lower, more youthful pretender that, however, is also not able eventually to defeat his opponent. In any case, back to Pindar's third Olympian ode, crowns demand discharge of sacred debt to celestials. The varied lyre, flutes, and verse structures blend in Doric measure to exalt the son of Enesidamus. Pisa launches the god-given songs toward mortals, for whom the Aetolian judge, following Heracles' ancient precept, composes the wild olive wreath of grey-green luster. Here we are. Heracles conveyed this olive from Easter's waves and shades after persuading Apollo's devoted Hyperborean people. Right? He really brought them from there. Seeking a tree to shade crowds and crown provost at Jupiter's altar, he noted the Alpheus site too bare and sun exposed. Recalling the Oleaster, he returned. Upon ascending to the gods, he entrusted the shining contest, testing men's valor and chariot speed to Leda's twin sons. So again, Theron and Immanence received lofty glory from the fair-steeded Dioscuri, because they honored the blessed with guest tables more than any other mortal and devoutly observed their festivals. Water holds preeminence, gold surpasses other riches. From native soil, Terran reach utmost bounds, touching Heracles' pillars. Beyond them neither wise nor ignorant proceed. The poet refrains from attempting what would be folly. All right. And so there is this important differentiation, different cultures or cycles, if you want, or civilizations that stemmed, in fact, from the primordial golden age, right? Carrying tradition, but declining it in different ways and ultimately losing it faster or slower, all right? So there is a sense of a southern force that is to be spotted in the metric cultures. And so we will see all this better in detail. I'm just telling you what we'll be seeing at some point. And this is naturally connected with, in part, what we call the Pelasgians, the agricultural war, the sedentarism, and this more contemplative lifestyle, where the Mother Earth rules over and swallows and digests and sort of expels everything. And there is a cyclical, passive view of life. And this emerges already in the Silver Age, right? And it is historically connected, before we mentioned the boar, with the priestly society. We never talked about Atlantis. And so the idea that from the Hyperborean Sea, fundamentally civilization would have descended south, where the Atlantic is. And that was, as you know, according to the Platonic Legion, destroyed. There's actually much more to that than Plato. Many people think it's just an allegory that Plato was using. If you have an idea of where these people were coming from, what kind of philosophy they were describing, you know that this is not some random example, right? This is just a completely secularistic and modernistic distraction and skepticistic nonsense that gets spread over and over and over and over again. There's plenty of other cultures that talk about the arrival of men of the West, right? This is all across the board. Europe, even Egypt, the pharaohs are admittedly tied to that mechanism. We will talk again better about this. I can't tell you when, because it's really a lot of work. It takes a long time. But I'm glad at least we're hinting at this. And so there's a more erotic dominance, right, that we paired, in fact, before with Demetrism, and that has to do, in fact, with a sensualistic degeneration of the mother. We've seen something with Ishtar, who's also the morning star, and so Venus, right? And so this Venusian representation of the goddess of love, Venus, that if anything, in Apollonian mythologies is a bit more, let's say it's a bit more castigated, right? It's paradoxically in the darker mythologies of the North that, as we explained before, for the Morgan comes back a bit more of in sensualistic terms. It's not to say that this is not the case also in the Apollonian ones, but there is a different hierarchy of power, different depth to that, right? As we were hinting at before, the Amazons instead are some sort of reaction that is actually not struggling, is not really trying to restore a paternal order, but more of a warlike combativeness, right? And a lunar restoration without paternal form. And so the dark side of the moon, as opposed to the Olympian Artemis, that is truly an Olympian, just like Athena and Apollo. Regardless of her being the queen of the forest, she actually made it in a mythology where Zeus rules, right? Just like Diana with a Jupiter, to that level, and lives also in Christian Catholicism, for example. There are beautiful representations of this also during the wars against the Turk, stepping probably over the crescent. That is, as you understand, a very old symbol, but loaded with this meaning of being able to tame it, or being at different times, like maybe an underdog trying to rise. And I'm not going to digress on this, but there is a lot to dig into that. And so there is a degeneration of the world, as you understand, through this. Titans appear, as we said before, as some kind of fatherless, quote-unquote, heroes that in fact do not make it into divinity. When you look at biblical tradition, you can frame this as Lucifer's attempt to begin with. There are lots, as we said, of other quote-unquote titans within the Bible as well that end up being aligned with God in angelic form. The Lucifer is the top one, and as we said before, the more gifted you are, the more power you have, the greatest the shattering. Your shattering is as you fail, even just for a minimum, because that means that truly you have betrayed even more the original principle. This is the meaning of Lucifer in biblical tradition. In all this, the generation of the Hyperborean restoration, right? The idea of the northern conquerors that bring from this Hyperborean influence. Hyperborea naturally has many different connotations of Olympian character. This can be explained geographically in theory, because we said that in any case tradition doesn't just speak as a metaphor, but each branch has sort of different points of reference in that regard. Branch of tradition, for example, Indo-European peoples, right? But we are in the Bronze Age at this point, where you have warriors and giants. When you see a Mycenaean king debarking on some random Aegean beach, covered in dendra panoply that obfuscates the senses that only truly a giant can wear in functionally employing combat. Like, you have to understand that the local fishermen would have truly understood at the time to be in the face of a demigod, right? That's what Achilles would have looked like, right? If we look at more familiar waters, we have Dionysianism. This is actually a masculine dimension from Dionysus, obviously enough, that, however, soon as you know, in the Hellenistic world, becomes devirilized into some passive and promiscuous ecstatic form. The Saint Romans suffer of this through the Bacchic cults that at some point are banned, in fact, from Rome. And these are all phenomena that existed also in other societies, but we know better through this. This is connected also with the way of the left hand, where the fire of death blazes. There is something to Dionysianism, Dionysianism that has to do with the frenzy of the lower tiers of the war band, right? The wolf pack, the shamanic trance, etc. That was meant to heighten this sort of the senses, and having this animal-like excitement would make sort of blood run in many ways, including sacrificial one, to initiate you to a higher path. But it doesn't actually bring you outside of the darkness, right? It's sort of weird. I don't know if you've seen the trailer Werewolf, how instead of talking about tradition, we still look at this kind of fringe, degenerate element of Dionysianism and this lower sort of creepy horror-like forms for Halloween, right, as opposed to some deeper understanding of the meaning. Heroism concludes the typology as this attempted restoration of Olympian solar spirituality together with transcendence of both the matter and the titan. And that's where Alexander, that's where Rome, walking in his footsteps, operate. Right, this truly succeed to establish an important marking point, because the Augustan era and the fulfillment of this golden age that had been prophesied, that re-happening between the Bronze and the Iron One, is also the start of Christianity. And so the idea that fundamentally a radical and a truly superhuman effort is once needed, of a spiritual reform, because people have lost the sense that they can't save themselves after the eventual decline, in fact, of the king priest, like the imperator, the princeps of the Res Publica Populi Romani, is also Pontifex Maximus, and so on. If you're interested, again, in Genius Augusti video, also in the Fortuna Kaisers, you will find a lot of that, and why Rome truly fulfills the Olympian solar evangelion for the Indo-European peoples. And so when you look at historical times, there's this overall meaning attributable to different civilizations, cultures, etc., where you can spot what was going on within it, right? So the Kaluga, the Dark Age, the Iron Age, is here for quite a while, for a couple of millennia, and the idea is that we can barely see there even the vestiges of tradition, spirituality. And people today somehow side with beliefs that even when in good hope, say, understood in positive terms, do not actually match with probably even the original one. Do you think that the majority of the religious people today, when you talk about ancient religions, actually know what at the time, 2,000 years ago, was really meant, right? I will not digress further because I don't want to say things, the interconfessional clashes, etc. But, I say, in fact, for the world of Christianity, do you realize that Christianity doesn't speak in a vacuum, right? That it's not like at some point was some strange transactional baptism with polytheistic superstition, and then Christianity arrives and changes everything. This has nothing to do with any traceable historical reality. From both sides, like even terms like monotheism or polytheism are just for the historically literate. They have nothing to do with history or religion whatsoever. But not in the sense that weren't used, but literally in the sense that had nothing to do with the spirituality of the time. the metaphysics, everything. Like, you can't understand the Gospels if you don't understand, I don't know, Hellenic or Roman theological vocabulary, right? Because it's written in the same language. So these are things, again, we will see better on another occasion. I'll speed up because I see this video is very long, and I wanted just to say this. The Egyptian teaching, as reflected in Plutarch's Liber Amatoris, distinguishes 3 stages of masculine force. The lowest remains telluric, wherein Eros manifests as the generative power pervading matter. And so it's the sensualistic aspect we said before, being a sex slave, right? Being tied to your whim and being subjected in that sense to the woman. And so seated, according to the source, in the fertilizing earth moisture. Higher stands the celestial Eros, corresponding to the lunar stage, where Earth itself appears as spouse of heaven and Eros as nocturnal temple guardian, Phaethon assigned by Aphrodite. Here the force, though still material and earthen like the moon, reaches the outermost limits of material nature. The moon forms the boundary between corporeal and incorporeal. I made a video about the Luna in Rebis, as a matter of fact, in the alchemic tradition. Perishable and imperishable worlds. That's how important Artemis really is as Diana. Purest of earthly bodies, yet impurest of heavenly ones. Beneath it lies the perishable, above the eternal. On the second stage, telluric Eros becomes Lunus Aphroditos, interestingly enough. So you have this double, this complementary element where you have the being combining both masculinity and femininity in complementarity, as in the divine, in hierarchical order. But at this level, femininity still maintains its higher right. So far as the material world extends, motherhood inwardly akin to materiality holds preponderance, and Aphrodite enjoys elevated veneration. A third elevation transforms Eros into solar power. You can reach that also through sensualism. In fact, there is a rich tradition of the metaphysics of sex, right? The idea of ancient initiatory practice tied to Eros in love-making as the key to a higher dimension. It's a beautiful literature, and perhaps we should start looking a bit at it, but ties also with all these various concepts. So masculinity in this third stage leaves the bounds of matter. So man truly elevates himself. While femininity by nature cannot shed materiality, man is wholly withdrawn and elevated to the incorporeality of sunlight. Aphrodite remains at the lunar stage where she predominates. Eros attains completion only in higher regions where imperishability resides. Only through Apollonian nature is man's right secured forever. So you see, Eros is a bit of a Mercury, right, stemming from Aphrodite. And so she has a bit of a Holy Ghost character, nature, the wings, etc. So that's the meaning of elevation, right? Being struck, but also the gateway to a higher level of love by taming the same Venus, as we understand here. The cosmic law commanding the moon to follow the sun is deeply tied to this, and borrow its silver gleam, likewise requiring the subordination of woman to man, because she takes the light from the sun. This was, as you know, as far as royalty and priesthood, the metaphor still used in medieval Europe for the papacy and the empire, respectively, the empire and the papacy, that had to fully cooperate only in this sense to retain full solar virility and divinity through this basis of the same church. It can never be eliminated, right? But must be tamed and possessed by the emperor. Development proceeds from below upward. In this leaving Earth's depths, the force rises to heaven and finally enters the sun. Now it simultaneously encompasses all 3 stages. One in Trinity, by the way. Trinity is all there. You can't understand it. In the European tradition, is fully Trinitarian and fully Catholic, if you understand what Catholic means, and that Catholic exists before Christianity as well. As it includes it unavoidably. As Apollo is represented triplex and as the lion in Egypt, right? It is also the Trismegistos, as a matter of fact, in the Hermetic tradition. Image of generative natural force comprehending both telluric waters and heavenly sunlight, the aforementioned attributes, right, that we expressed before of autotheos and autotelos are exactly what this means. And as you understand, the third stage can now be grasped as first and original, because you just arose from the bottom up, right, from the original, from the primordial, from the absolute, from the solar, from the virile. What emerges last into consciousness appears as first and primordial. The sun becomes the primal power from which the two lower stages emanate through successive emanation. In fact, it's like the silver and the bronze age corresponding to that, because the fourth age is nothingness, right? What it becomes last is by nature first, and what is last in generation is first. And so the Apollo rebooting the cycle. This is crucial, as we've seen, regenerating, reinvigorating the same tree of life that he repossesses in that philosophical incest. From the summit of completed philosophical, if you prefer, from the summit of completed development, the lower stages appear entirely secondary, issuing from the descent of highest force into subordinate material levels. Egyptians celebrate in the month Pamenot the sun god's entrance into the moon. Mythological development, of course, however, follows the opposite path. The purer spiritual idea of divinity enters human consciousness last. A series of steps must be traversed from earth to heaven until that metaphysical height is attained. Everything in human life and being is acquisition. The stepwise purified idea of divinity is not bestowed but earned by the race. Always. Right? It's always your merit. Like, you're not simply chosen. Like, this is what, for example, well, here let's not talk about, again, other theological issues of sort of post, of not probably non-Catholic beliefs, but it's never a mere act of God, right? Your divine grace always derives the Holy Ghost from your merit and virtue. Works do work, right? You can't save yourself. Theosis, it's encoded in Catholic theology, right? Christian Catholic theology as well. The step pyramid crowning many Asiatic and Hellenic tombs likely embodied the thought of development ascending in similar sequence from the broad material base toward heaven, mirroring the development of humankind generally and of each individual. The step pyramid images the entire religious development upon which every other depends as effect from cause. It's pretty obvious, right? It's the symbol of the mountain, of the Olympus, of the capital, of the Asgard, etc. It proceeds from below upward and ultimately attains what is first, invisible spirit that existed from the beginning, right? The more instantiated in the world, the more fallen. And so with the vertex of the pyramid nullifying in heaven, actually you have the passage to the other dimension, to the higher nature. Right. And so in accordance with this law, humanity, and there is a pretty substantial amount of, for example, Egyptian tradition that we never really talked about, but is incredibly interesting. It had an influence on also the Mediterranean one, the Greeks and the Romans. Advance from mother right to father right. Right. This was the intuition, if you're familiar with the name of Bachhofen, that looked at this passage that had, in some cultures, been reaffirmed, as we said before, during the Bronze Age, and that sort of had here contentiously in the theory began with the material imperfect right and concluded with the spiritual perfect right. But this only after the fall, after the degeneration through the eras, right? And so this means that it's technically still possible to achieve the pristine status, even though, again, by prophecy, this is not meant to be. There is a great struggle in the end time that regards what people can put together as a host in the firmament, but it's something that appears episodically, right? And if anything, we will deal with also looking at military history better. Pretty long video today. In fact, I have to quit it because my technical means do not allow me to publish, to create, if anything, not to publish. videos that are like larger than 3 hours, but today sometimes it's got even shorter with 2 hours and 40. The audio is not there anymore. And so I actually stop it here for today. I was very glad in any case to talk about this. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.